The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the ranch house, just as the September sun began its descent toward the Montana horizon, and Grace Ramsey stepped down into the dust with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a determination that had carried her all the way from St. Louis. The foreman, a grizzled man named Dutch, squinted at her from beneath his hat. "You are the cook." "I am," Grace said, straightening her shoulders. She was 22 years old, and every mile of the journey west had been paid for with money she had saved from 3 years of working in a boarding house kitchen. The advertisement had been clear. A cattle ranch in Montana Territory needed a cook for the autumn roundup and the winter months. Room and board included, wages fair. She had written immediately. Dutch nodded slowly, then gestured toward the long, low building that served as the bunkhouse. "The boys will be in from the range soon. They will be hungry. Kitchen is attached to the main house, through that door there." Grace followed his pointing finger to a sturdy structure built of logs and rough-hewn timber. The ranch spread out before her in all directions, a vast expanse of grassland dotted with cattle, fenced corrals, and outbuildings. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. The air smelled of sage and livestock, so different from the coal smoke and river damp of the city she had left behind. She made her way to the kitchen and pushed open the door. The room was larger than she had expected, with a massive iron stove dominating one wall, shelves stacked with supplies, and a long wooden table scarred with years of use. Pots and pans hung from hooks, and through the window she could see the corral where horses moved restlessly in the fading light. Grace set down her carpetbag and rolled up her sleeves. There was no time for sentiment or second thoughts. She had come here to work, to make a new life far from the memories that haunted her in St. Louis. Her father had died 2 years ago, her mother 3 years before that. She had no siblings, no suitors she cared for, and no reason to stay in a city that felt increasingly suffocating. The West called to people like her, people who wanted to start fresh. She found flour, lard, and salt pork in the pantry, along with dried beans and coffee. Within an hour, she had biscuits in the oven and beans simmering on the stove. The coffee pot bubbled cheerfully, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma. As the light faded outside, she heard the sound of voices and boots on the porch. The door swung open and they filed in, dusty and tired, their faces weathered by sun and wind. There were 8 of them, ranging in age from a boy who could not have been more than 17 to a man with silver threading through his dark hair. They stopped when they saw her, surprise evident on every face. "Evening, madam," the silver-haired man said, removing his hat. "I am James Carter, the ranch owner. Dutch said you had arrived." "Grace Ramsey," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Supper will be ready in 10 minutes. There is water heating on the stove if you want to wash up." They exchanged glances, then moved toward the wash basin near the door with an almost comical eagerness. Grace hid a smile and returned to her work, pulling the golden biscuits from the oven and ladling beans into a large serving bowl. She sliced the salt pork she had fried and arranged everything on the table along with a jar of molasses she had found in the pantry. The men settled onto the benches flanking the table, and for a moment there was silence as they filled their plates. Then the eating began in earnest, and Grace felt a small glow of satisfaction. They were hungry and her food was good. That was enough for now. "Best biscuits I have had in a year," one of the younger cowboys said through a mouthful of food. He had sandy hair and a sunburned nose, and he grinned at her with unabashed enthusiasm. "Name is Tommy Walsh. These beans are not half bad either," another man added. He was tall and lean with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were a striking shade of blue-gray, and when he looked at her, Grace felt something flutter in her chest. "York Olsen. Most folks just call me York." "Pleased to meet you all," Grace said, staying near the stove where she could refill the coffee pot as needed. She studied the men as they ate, learning their faces and names. There was Marcus, the oldest hand, and Billy, the youngest. There was Red, whose name matched his hair, and Samuel, who was quiet and serious. There was Frank, who had a scar across his left eyebrow, and Jesse, who seemed to find humor in everything. But it was York Olsen who kept drawing her attention. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with capable hands and an easy way of moving that suggested confidence without arrogance. When he caught her looking, he did not leer or make her uncomfortable. He simply nodded, a small acknowledgement, and returned to his meal. After supper, the men helped clear the table without being asked, which surprised Grace. In St. Louis, the men she had known would have left such work to women without a second thought. But here, in this rough country, there seemed to be a different code. Everyone pulled their weight. "Tomorrow we ride out at dawn," James Carter said as the men prepared to head to the bunkhouse. "The autumn roundup starts in earnest. We will be bringing cattle down from the high country before the snow comes." "I will have breakfast ready before first light," Grace promised. York lingered after the others had filed out. "Do you need help with anything else, Miss Ramsey?" "Grace," she said. "And no, thank you, I can manage." He nodded but did not immediately leave. "It is good to have proper cooking again. The last fellow we had could barely boil water without burning it. He left in July, and we have been making do since then." "I am glad to be of use," Grace said, aware of how prim she sounded. There was something about York that made her nervous in a way she could not quite define. It was not fear exactly. It was more like anticipation. "Well, good night then," York said, finally turning toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. "Welcome to the ranch, Grace." After he left, Grace finished cleaning the kitchen and made her way to the small room off the pantry that would be her quarters. It held a narrow bed, a dresser, and a washstand. A small window looked out toward the mountains. It was sparse, but it was clean, and it was hers. She unpacked her few belongings, said her prayers, and climbed into bed, exhausted from the long journey. She fell asleep to the sound of wind in the eaves and the distant lowing of cattle. The days fell into a rhythm. Grace rose before dawn to start breakfast, feeding the men hearty meals of flapjacks, eggs when the chickens were laying, bacon or sausage, and endless pots of coffee. They would ride out for the day, and she would spend her time preparing the evening meal, baking bread, doing laundry, and tending the kitchen garden that still held a few late vegetables. The work was hard, but it was satisfying in a way her work in St. Louis had never been. Here, she was not just another hired hand in a crowded boarding house. She was essential to the operation of the ranch. The men depended on her, and she took pride in keeping them well fed. York often stayed behind to help with small tasks, mending a loose board on the porch steps, fixing a hinge on the pantry door, carrying in firewood. He was not overly talkative, but his presence was comfortable, and Grace found herself looking forward to those moments when it was just the two of them, working in companionable silence. One evening, as October painted the cottonwood trees gold and the air took on a sharp edge, York came into the kitchen after supper with something wrapped in burlap. "Thought you might like this," he said, setting the bundle on the table. Grace unwrapped it to find a haunch of venison, fresh and still warm. "I shot a deer this afternoon," York explained. "Figured it would make a nice change from salt pork." "It will indeed," Grace said, pleased. "Thank you, York, this is very kind," he shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. Just seemed like the right thing to do. As he turned to leave, Grace found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "Would you like a cup of coffee? I just made a fresh pot." York's face lit up with a smile that transformed his usually serious expression. "I would like that very much." They sat at the table, the kitchen warm from the stove, and talked while the light faded outside. Grace learned that York had grown up in Nebraska, the son of a farmer who had lost everything to drought and grasshoppers. He had come west at 18, working various ranches and learning the cattle business. He had been at Carter's ranch for 3 years now, and he spoke of it with a fondness that suggested he considered it home. "What brought you out here?" York asked, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. Grace hesitated, then decided on honesty. "There was nothing left for me in St. Louis. My parents are both gone, and I wanted a fresh start. I wanted to go somewhere I could make my own way." "That takes courage," York said quietly. "A lot of people would rather stay with what they know, even if it makes them miserable." "What about you?" Grace asked. "Do you plan to stay here, or do you have dreams of your own place?" York was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. "I have been saving my wages. Someday I would like to have a small spread of my own. Nothing fancy, just enough land for some cattle and a decent house. A place that is mine." "That is a good dream," Grace said. "It is lonely, though," York admitted, and there was something vulnerable in his voice. "A ranch is not much without someone to share it with." Their eyes met across the table, and Grace felt that flutter in her chest again, stronger this time. She looked away first, suddenly flustered, and stood to clear the cups. "I should let you get some rest," York said, rising as well. "Thank you for the coffee and the conversation." "Any time," Grace said, and meant it. After that evening, York took to staying later more often, and their conversations grew longer and more personal. Grace told him about her childhood in St. Louis, about her mother's beautiful singing voice and her father's love of books. York told her about his younger sister, who had married a shopkeeper in Omaha, and about the first time he had seen the mountains and felt like he was finally where he belonged. The other cowboys noticed, of course. Tommy teased York good-naturedly, and Jesse made exaggerated swooning gestures when Grace was not looking. But there was no meanness in it, and Grace found that she did not mind. The attention from York felt right in a way that the clumsy courtship attempts from boys in St. Louis never had. As October turned to November, the weather grew colder. Snow dusted the ground one morning, melted by noon, then returned heavier the next week. The cattle had been brought down from the high country, and the men turned their attention to mending fences, stocking hay, and preparing for the hard months ahead. One afternoon, as Grace was kneading bread dough, York came into the kitchen with an unusual nervousness about him. He took off his hat and turned it in his hands, not quite meeting her eyes. "Grace, I was wondering something." She paused in her work, giving him her full attention. "Yes. Well, there is a dance in town next Saturday, in Spokane. It is about a 2-hour ride, but the weather should hold. I was thinking, if you wanted, maybe you would like to go with me." Grace felt her heart leap. She had not been to a proper dance since before her father died, and the thought of going with York made her almost giddy. But she forced herself to stay calm. "I would like that very much," she said, smiling at him. York's face broke into a wide grin. "Really? That is wonderful. I will borrow the wagon from James, make it more comfortable for the ride." "That sounds perfect," Grace said. After he left, practically bouncing with excitement, Grace allowed herself a moment to press her flour-dusted hands to her warm cheeks. She was going to a dance with York Olsen, and she could not remember the last time she had felt so happy. The week passed in a blur of anticipation. Grace took out her best dress, a deep green wool that brought out the color of her hazel eyes, and pressed it carefully. She had a wool cloak that would keep her warm, and she polished her good boots until they gleamed. On Saturday, the sky was clear and cold, the sun bright on the snow-patched ground. York brought the wagon around mid-morning, and Grace saw that he had lined the bed with blankets and straw to make it warmer. He had clearly made an effort with his own appearance, wearing a clean shirt and a vest, his hair neatly combed. "You look beautiful," he said when he saw her, and the sincerity in his voice made Grace's cheeks flush with pleasure. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." The ride to Spokane took them through country that was harsh but breathtaking in its own way. The mountains rose in jagged peaks to the west, and the prairie stretched endlessly in the other directions, broken only by occasional stands of trees and the winding paths of creeks. York kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the territory. Spokane was larger than Grace had expected, a bustling town with a main street lined with shops, a hotel, a bank, and several saloons. The dance was being held in the community hall, a sturdy building near the center of town. Music already spilled out into the street, and Grace could see couples through the windows, whirling across the floor. York helped her down from the wagon, his hands warm and strong at her waist, and offered her his arm. Together, they walked into the hall, and Grace felt like she was stepping into another world. The room was crowded with people, ranchers and townspeople dressed in their finest. A band played in one corner, fiddles and a guitar creating lively music that made Grace's feet want to move. Long tables held food and punch, and the air was warm from the press of bodies and the heat of the stove. "Would you like to dance?" York asked, and without waiting for an answer, he led her onto the floor. Grace had not danced in years, but York was a confident partner, and she found herself falling into the rhythm easily. They whirled and stepped through a reel, then a waltz, and Grace felt lighter than air. York's hand was firm at her waist, his eyes never leaving her face, and she knew without a doubt that she was falling in love with him. Between dances, they sampled the food and talked with other people from the surrounding ranches. Everyone seemed to know York, and they greeted Grace with friendly curiosity. She felt welcomed, part of a community in a way she never had in the anonymity of the city. As the evening wore on, York led her outside for a moment of quiet. The street was cold and still, the stars brilliant overhead in a way they never were in St. Louis with its coal smoke and streetlights. "Grace, I need to tell you something," York said, his breath misting in the cold air. She looked up at him, her heart pounding. "What is it?" "I know you only came to the ranch for the winter, but I do not want you to leave when spring comes. I want you to stay, not just as the cook, but because—" He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Because I have fallen in love with you. I know it has only been a couple of months, but I have never been more sure of anything. You make every day better just by being there. And I know I do not have much to offer yet, but I am saving for that land I told you about, and I would work every day of my life to make you happy if you would give me the chance." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "York, I have fallen in love with you too. I came west looking for a fresh start, and I found so much more than I ever hoped for. I found you." York's face lit up with a joy that was almost painful to witness. "Does that mean you will stay? Beyond the winter?" "I will stay," Grace said, "for as long as you want me." "Forever then," York said, and he leaned down to kiss her. It was gentle and sweet, full of promise, and Grace felt like she was finally, truly home. They stayed at the dance until late, and on the ride back to the ranch, Grace leaned against York's shoulder, wrapped in blankets and happiness. The stars wheeled overhead, and the horses' hooves beat a steady rhythm on the frozen ground. When they arrived back at the ranch, York walked her to the kitchen door. "I suppose this is good night," he said reluctantly. "For now," Grace agreed. But there will be many more nights, York. We have time. All the time in the world, he agreed, and kissed her once more before heading to the bunkhouse. Grace floated through the next few days in a haze of happiness. The other cowboys noticed the change immediately, and there was much good-natured ribbing directed at York. He took it all with a grin, clearly too happy to care. James Carter pulled Grace aside one afternoon as she was hanging laundry. "York told me about you too," he said, his weathered face kind. "I want you to know that you are both welcome here for as long as you want to stay. York is one of the best hands I have ever had, and you are the finest cook this ranch has seen. But more than that, I can see that you make each other happy, and that matters." "Thank you, Mr. Carter," Grace said, touched by his words. "That means a great deal." "Call me James," he said. "And if you two decide to marry, I would be honored to stand up with you." The winter settled in fully after that, with snow that lasted and temperatures that plunged below zero at night. The work changed with the season. The cattle needed to be fed hay, water troughs had to be chopped free of ice, and the men spent more time in and around the ranch buildings rather than ranging far afield. Grace's kitchen became the heart of the ranch, warm and welcoming while the wind howled outside. She cooked hearty stews and roasts, baked pies from dried apples, and kept the coffee pot always full. York carved her a beautiful wooden spoon from a piece of ash, smooth and perfectly balanced in her hand. She treasured it more than any store-bought gift. On Christmas Eve, James surprised everyone by producing a bottle of whiskey he had been saving, and they all gathered in the kitchen for a celebration. Grace had made a special supper of roast beef, potatoes, and a cake with real sugar frosting. They sang carols, their rough voices surprisingly harmonious, and exchanged small gifts. York gave Grace a shawl he had bought in town, soft wool in a beautiful blue-gray that matched his eyes. She gave him a shirt she had sewn from fabric she had purchased with her own wages, carefully stitched and fitted to him. The look on his face when he opened it made all the hours of work worthwhile. "I have never had anything so fine," he said quietly, running his fingers over the fabric. "You deserve fine things," Grace told him. "You deserve every good thing in the world." Later, when the others had drifted off to the bunkhouse, full of food and whiskey and Christmas cheer, York and Grace stood together on the porch, watching the snow fall in the darkness. "I am going to talk to James after the new year," York said, "about buying some land that adjoins the ranch. He mentioned once that he might be willing to sell a parcel, and I think I have enough saved now for a down payment. It would not be much at first, just a small cabin and maybe 20 head of cattle, but it would be a start." "Our start," Grace said, and York pulled her close. "Our start," he agreed. "Grace, will you marry me? I know I should probably wait, do this proper with a ring and everything, but I cannot wait another moment. I want you to be my wife. I want to build that life we have talked about together." "Yes," Grace said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, of course I will marry you." They were married on a cold January day in the small church in Spokane. Grace wore the green dress and carried a bouquet of dried flowers that Jesse had surprisingly produced from somewhere. All the cowboys from the ranch attended, along with James Carter and various townspeople who had met them at the dance. The preacher was a kindly man who kept the ceremony short, mindful of the cold. When York slipped the simple gold band onto Grace's finger, she felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she was meant to be. This was who she was meant to be with. They spent their wedding night in the hotel in Spokane, a luxury that felt almost decadent after months of rough ranch living. York was gentle and patient, and Grace felt cherished in a way she had never experienced before. They talked through the night, making plans and dreaming dreams, until they finally fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms. When they returned to the ranch, James Carter formally offered to sell them 160 acres that bordered his property to the north. York signed the papers with shaking hands, and just like that, they were landowners. The rest of the winter was spent planning. York and some of the other cowboys worked on building a cabin on the new land whenever the weather permitted. Grace continued to cook for the ranch, saving every penny of her wages to add to their nest egg. She also began sewing curtains and quilts, preparing for the day when they would move into their own home. As winter slowly gave way to spring, the cabin took shape. It was small, just 2 rooms, but it was solid and well built. York had put in windows that faced the mountains, and he built Grace a kitchen that was smaller than the ranch house kitchen but perfectly designed for her use. There was a bedroom with space for a bed and a dresser, and a main room that would serve as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room. In April, when the snow had melted and the first green shoots of grass were appearing, they moved into the cabin. James Carter gifted them a cow and her calf, and York had already purchased 20 head of cattle with his savings. They also had 3 horses, a few chickens that Grace had raised from chicks at the ranch, and a vegetable garden plot that Grace was eager to plant. Their first night in the cabin, they sat on the porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Grace leaned against York's shoulder, feeling a contentment so deep it was almost painful. "We did it," she said softly. "We have our own place." "We did," York agreed, his arm tight around her. "And this is just the beginning, Grace. We are going to build something wonderful here." The first year was hard work. York spent long days riding the range, tending the cattle, mending fences, and doing the hundreds of tasks required to make a ranch successful. Grace planted the garden, tended the chickens, cooked and cleaned, and helped with the cattle when York needed an extra hand. They were exhausted most nights, but they were happy. James Carter remained a good friend and mentor, offering advice and help when needed but never making them feel beholden. The cowboys from the original ranch often rode over to visit, and Grace would feed them and catch up on news. Tommy had gotten himself engaged to a girl from town, and Jesse had finally stopped his wandering ways and settled into being a reliable hand. In August, Grace realized she was pregnant. She told York one evening after supper, and he lifted her off her feet and spun her around, whooping with joy. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes, we are," Grace said, laughing at his excitement. "Probably sometime in March if I am calculating correctly." York immediately became protective, insisting that Grace not work too hard, that she rest more, that she let him do everything. Grace found it both endearing and exasperating, but she understood. This baby represented everything they were building together, a future that extended beyond just the 2 of them. The pregnancy progressed well through the autumn and into the winter. Grace continued to work, though she did let York take over some of the heavier tasks. She sewed tiny clothes and knitted blankets, preparing for the baby's arrival. York built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. In March, as promised, Grace went into labor. York rode like the wind to fetch the midwife from Spokane, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when York, waiting anxiously outside, thought he might lose his mind with worry. But finally, in the early hours of the morning, he heard the sharp, angry cry of a newborn. Mrs. Henderson opened the door, smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Olsen, a healthy boy, and your wife is tired but well." York rushed into the bedroom to find Grace propped up against the pillows, exhausted but glowing, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Meet your son," she said. York sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at the tiny, red face of his child. The baby had a shock of dark hair and seemed to be scowling at the unfairness of being born. York felt his heart expand in his chest, making room for this new, overwhelming love. "He is perfect," York whispered. "You are both perfect." They named him Thomas James after Tommy and James Carter, and the baby quickly became the center of their world. York proved to be a devoted father, getting up in the night to walk with the baby when he was fussy, making silly faces to elicit smiles, and boasting to anyone who would listen about his son's various accomplishments. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. York was a smart cattleman, and Grace proved to have a head for business. Within 3 years, they had doubled their herd and added another room to the cabin. Thomas grew into a lively, curious toddler who loved following his father around the ranch. In the spring of their 4th year of marriage, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she felt more confident and the pregnancy was easier. In December, she gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret Rose, a tiny, delicate baby with Grace's hazel eyes and York's stubborn chin. The years flowed past like water, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the milestones of their children's growth. Thomas learned to ride almost before he could walk properly, his face serious with concentration as York led him around on a gentle mare. Margaret proved to have her mother's gift in the kitchen and her father's determination, a combination that suggested she would be a force to be reckoned with. In their 7th year of marriage, Grace was shocked to discover she was pregnant again at 31. York was delighted, though also concerned for Grace's health. But she sailed through the pregnancy with energy to spare, and in the spring, she gave birth to twin boys. They named them Samuel and Daniel, and the cabin suddenly seemed very small and very loud. York and James Carter worked together to add on to the house, creating a proper second story with bedrooms for the children. The ranch now ran nearly 300 head of cattle, and York had hired 2 hands to help with the work. They were prosperous, by the standards of the territory, but more than that, they were happy. Grace often thought back to that day when she had stepped off the stagecoach, dusty and determined and more than a little scared. She had come west looking for a fresh start, for a place to belong. She had found that and so much more. She had found love, partnership, family, and a home that was truly hers. One evening, when the children were in bed and the dishes were washed, Grace and York sat on the porch as they so often did. Thomas was nearly 10 now, helping with the cattle like a proper cowboy. Margaret was 8, clever and quick. The twins were 6, wild and inseparable. The house was full of noise and laughter, of arguments and reconciliations, of all the messy, beautiful chaos of family life. "Do you remember when I asked you to go to that dance in Spokane?" York asked, his hand finding Grace's in the darkness. "Of course I remember," Grace said. "I was so nervous I could barely lace my boots properly." York laughed. "I was terrified you would say no. I had been working up the courage for weeks." "I am very glad you asked," Grace said softly. "Me too," York agreed. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Grace, do you ever regret staying? Do you ever wish you had gone back to St. Louis or moved on to somewhere else?" Grace turned to look at him, this man who had captured her heart so completely. His face was more weathered now, with lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. His hands were calloused from hard work, and there was gray starting to show at his temples. He was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "This is where I belong, York. With you, with our children on this land we have built together. You told me once that a ranch is not much without someone to share it with." Well, I found the someone I want to share everything with. That is you. It has always been you." York pulled her close and kissed her, and Grace thought about how far they had both come. From that first meal in the ranch kitchen to this moment, with 4 children sleeping inside and a whole future stretching ahead of them, they had built a life worth living. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Spring brought calving and branding, long days of hard work but also of renewal. Summer meant moving the cattle to high pastures and endless work repairing and improving the ranch. Autumn brought the roundup and the preparation for winter. Winter meant drawing close, keeping warm and waiting for the cycle to begin again. Thomas grew into a fine young man, serious and responsible beyond his years. At 16, he could handle the ranch as well as York, and he had his father's gift with horses. He had started courting a girl from a neighboring ranch, and York and Grace watched with amusement and a touch of melancholy as their oldest child began his journey toward making his own family. Margaret developed a reputation for the best pies in the territory, and people would ride for hours to buy them from her. She had a sharp wit and a kind heart, and she had declared her intention to be a teacher. Grace and York were determined to make that happen, even if it meant sending her to school in Spokane. The twins, Samuel and Daniel, were 13 now and constant companions. They were wilder than their older siblings had been, always getting into some sort of mischief, but they were good boys at heart. They had York's humor and Grace's fierce loyalty to family. The ranch had become one of the most successful in the region. York had a reputation as a fair boss and a skilled cattleman. Grace was known for her hospitality, and their home was always open to travelers and neighbors in need. They had worked hard for everything they had, and they had earned the respect of the community. On their 20th wedding anniversary, York surprised Grace by taking her back to Spokane for a celebration. They stayed at the same hotel where they had spent their wedding night, and they attended a dance in the same community hall where York had first told her he loved her. Grace wore a new dress, a deep blue silk that York had ordered specially from a catalog. She was 42 now, and her hair had threads of silver in it. There were lines on her face that had not been there 20 years ago, marks left by laughter and worry and the passage of time. But when York looked at her, she felt as beautiful as she had at 22. They danced together, moving easily through the familiar steps, and Grace marveled at how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The love she felt for York had only deepened and matured, growing roots that went down to the core of who she was. "You know what I was thinking earlier?" York asked as they swayed to a waltz. "Tell me," Grace said. "I was remembering that first night when you made biscuits and beans for supper. I looked at you standing by that stove and I thought to myself, that is the woman I am going to marry. I did not even know your name yet, but I knew." Grace laughed, delighted. "You never told me that before." "I did not want to sound like a fool," York admitted, "but it is true. I took one look at you and I knew you were going to change my life." "You changed mine too," Grace said. "You gave me everything I did not even know I wanted, a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me love, York. Real love, the kind that lasts. And it will last," York said firmly. "Until the day I die and beyond, Grace, I will love you beyond." They stayed in Spokane for 3 days, a luxury they rarely allowed themselves. They ate in restaurants, walked through the shops, and simply enjoyed being together without the constant demands of ranch life. But by the 3rd day, they were both eager to get home, to see their children and get back to their land. When they arrived back at the ranch, they found that Thomas had managed everything perfectly in their absence. The cattle were all accounted for, the chores were done, and Margaret had kept the household running smoothly. The twins had stayed out of serious trouble. which was about all one could ask. That evening, with the whole family gathered around the dinner table, Grace looked at each face and felt such a surge of love and gratitude that she had to blink back tears. This was her life, this loud, chaotic, wonderful life. Every difficult moment, every sacrifice, every long day of work had been worth it to arrive at this moment. As the children grew older and more independent, Grace and York found more time for each other. They would ride out together in the evenings, checking on the cattle but also just enjoying the land and the peace. They talked about everything and nothing, the conversation of two people who knew each other so well that words were almost unnecessary. When Thomas was 20, he married his sweetheart, Emily, and brought her to live on the ranch. York had already begun building them a cabin on the far side of the property, a wedding gift, and an acknowledgement that Thomas was ready to start his own branch of the family legacy. Margaret did indeed become a teacher, attending a normal school in Spokane, and then returning to teach in a small schoolhouse near the ranch. She married at 24, choosing a quiet rancher named David who loved her fierce independence and sharp mind. The twins were slower to settle down, but that was to be expected. They were still young, still figuring out who they wanted to be. Grace was in no hurry to see them go. There would be time enough for that. As Grace entered her 50s, she began to slow down, not from illness but simply from the accumulation of years of hard work. York, now in his mid-50s, had a few more aches and pains than he once did, but he was still strong and capable. They had hired more help for the ranch, and Thomas had taken over much of the day-to-day management, allowing York and Grace to step back a little. They became grandparents when Thomas and Emily had a daughter, and then a son, and then another daughter. Margaret and David added 3 more grandchildren to the count. The ranch house, which had seemed so spacious when it was just the two of them, now overflowed with family on Sundays and holidays. Grace taught her granddaughters to cook and sew, passing down the skills her own mother had taught her. York taught his grandsons to ride and rope, his patience infinite as they struggled to master skills he made look easy. They were building a legacy that would extend far beyond their own lives, a family rooted in this land and this way of life. On a warm evening in late summer, when Grace was 58 and York was 61, they sat on the porch as they had done countless times before. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything gold and pink and orange. The sounds of the ranch were familiar and comforting. Horses in the corral, cattle lowing in the distance, chickens settling in for the night. "We have had a good life, Haven not we," Grace said, her hand in York's. "The best life," York agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." "I was just thinking," Grace said slowly, "about that first autumn when I arrived. I was so determined to prove myself, to show that I could make it out here. I had no idea what I was getting into." York chuckled. "You sure proved yourself. Best cook, best wife, best mother, best partner anyone could ask for. You exceeded every expectation, Grace." "We did it together," Grace said. "That is the important part. We built this together, York. Everything we have we made as a team." "I could not have done any of it without you," York said. "I told you that night in Spokane that I wanted you to stay longer than winter, that I wanted you forever. That was the smartest thing I ever said." "Stay longer than winter," Grace repeated, smiling at the memory. "I stayed for a lifetime, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead. Somewhere inside the house, they could hear the sound of voices as the twins argued good-naturedly about something. Thomas and Emily's oldest would be riding over in the morning to help with the horses. Margaret was planning to visit at the end of the week with her children. The ranch would go on, Grace knew. It would pass to their children and then to their grandchildren, changing and growing but always rooted in the land that she and York had built their life on. They had created something that would last, a legacy of love and hard work and family. As the night deepened and the air cooled, York stood and offered Grace his hand. "Shall we go in, Mrs. Olsen?" Grace took his hand and let him help her up, marveling as she always did at how natural it felt to be with him. 28 years of marriage, and she still felt a flutter in her chest when he smiled at her. "Yes, Mr. Olsen," she said, "let us go home." And hand in hand, they walked into the house they had built together, ready for whatever the future would bring, secure in the knowledge that they had created something beautiful and lasting. Grace had come west as a cook for Cowboys, looking for a fresh start. She had found love, family, and a home that would endure for generations. She had found everything she never knew she was searching for, all because one cowboy had asked her to stay longer than winter, and she had said yes. The years continued to pass gently. Grace and York grew older with Grace, their faces weathered by sun and wind but their love still strong. They celebrated their 30th anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, a rowdy, joyful gathering that lasted an entire weekend. When Grace was 65 and York was 68, he finally agreed to fully retire from the active management of the ranch, turning it over completely to Thomas. They kept the original cabin, the one York had built, and spent their days puttering around the garden, visiting with family, and simply enjoying the peace they had earned. York's health began to fail in his early 70s, his heart growing weak. Grace nursed him tenderly, holding his hand through the difficult days and making sure he was comfortable. He remained cheerful despite the pain, telling stories to his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing down the history of the family and the ranch. On a spring morning, with the windows open to let in the sweet air and Grace holding his hand, York Olsen passed away peacefully at the age of 73. Grace sat with him for a long time afterward, tears streaming down her face, but also feeling a sense of peace. They had had 42 years together, years filled with love and partnership and the kind of deep companionship that most people never experienced. They buried York on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a cottonwood tree. The entire community turned out for the funeral, a testament to the respect and affection people had for him. Grace stood at the graveside, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and she felt York's presence as strongly as if he were standing beside her. Grace lived for another 7 years after York's death, remaining active and engaged with the family. She taught her great-granddaughters to make biscuits the way she had made them that first night at the ranch. She told stories about the old days, about the hard work and the lean times and the incredible joy of building something from nothing. She never remarried, nor did she want to. York had been her partner, her love, her everything. No one could replace him, and she did not want anyone to try. On a warm autumn day, just after her 75th birthday, Grace passed away quietly in her sleep. They buried her next to York under the cottonwood tree, and the family placed a simple headstone that read, "Grace Ramsey Olsen, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She stayed longer than winter." The ranch continued on, passed down through the generations. Thomas ran it until he was old enough to pass it to his own children. The cabin where Grace and York had lived became a treasured family landmark, preserved and maintained as a reminder of where it all began. And on summer evenings, when the sun set behind the mountains and the air was filled with the sounds of cattle and horses, the family would gather on porches and tell stories. They told about Grace, who came west as a cook and stayed to build a legacy. They told about York, who asked her to stay and built her a home. They told about love and hard work and the kind of partnership that could transform two people into something greater than either could have been alone. The story of Grace and York became a family legend, passed down through the generations, a reminder that the greatest adventures often begin with the smallest acts of courage. Grace had stepped off a stagecoach in Montana territory with nothing but determination and hope. York had invited her to stay beyond a single season. Together, they had created a love story that would endure long after they were gone, woven into the very fabric of the land they had worked and the family they had built. And every time a new generation looked at the mountains Grace had loved or worked the land York had tended, they remembered that this was all built on love, on two people who found each other against all odds and chose to build something beautiful together. That was their legacy, and it would last forever.